Thank you very much. So today I'm talking about ableism in academia and a review of experiences and impact of ableism among faculty and staff, so researchers and folks working in universities. So normally my research focuses on children and youth with disabilities, but the passion for this particular paper came from, so I have a disability as well that I've had for over 20 years as a result of a medical error, and this is what has driven my passion for this particular paper, because I was curious to see if others like myself as a scientist, are they having similar experiences in academia. So just a bit of the background, and I won't go over ableism and what it is. I think we've all learned about that over the past 2 days. But we know that people with disabilities are considered one of the world's largest minority groups, and they're often one of the most overlooked as well. But despite legislation that's designed to affirm the rights of people with disabilities, research highlights that there's actually been an increase in ableism over the last decade. And people with disabilities continue to face social exclusion, non-accommodating environments, and a lack of opportunities, especially within academics. So in looking at ableism within academia, we know that about 35, and I think some of these stats might be Canadian, but I'm guessing that they may be similar trends in the US. Faculty with disabilities are among one of the groups experiencing the highest rates of discrimination in post-secondary institutions. And around 35% of university professors, instructors, or researchers with a disability experience ableism or unfair treatment. And about half, so around 47%, encountered at least one form of harassment over the past year. Many post-secondary institutions, as we've heard over the past couple of days, often follow an individualized medical model of disability, and this is problematic because it often isolates and stigmatizes people with disabilities who then feel that they don't feel comfortable in disclosing their disability and requesting accommodations. So within Canada, and I think the trends are probably around the same in the US, only about 6% of university professors, instructors, or teachers, or researchers self-identify as having a disability, even though about 20% of the working age population has a disability. So that's telling us, I think it's even lower in some countries, like UK, for example, is only about 2%. Faculty and staff in universities are disclosing, even though about 16% of the working age population has a disability. So this is telling us that there are folks with disabilities are having many challenges in getting into academia, and also that they may feel uncomfortable or unsafe in disclosing that they have a disability. And again, I think some of the acronyms are different in Canada versus the US. So in Canada, we call it EDI, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I think it's a different acronym here. But there's increasing attention on higher education institutions to ensure that they reflect the diversity of their communities. And as these EDI initiatives have increased across academic institutions, they've also been criticized for being ineffective and motivated primarily by a concern for appearing inclusive rather than a desire to implement real change. And many researchers are arguing that disability has received much less attention compared to other equity-deserving groups within these EDI discussions. So for example, a recent review of EDI initiatives within universities that focus specifically on people with disabilities highlighted that more training on disability is needed among university administrators to eliminate biases that are related to abilities and ability privilege. So, for example, this particular review found that in EDI definitions that they reviewed, they found that people with disabilities were the only equity-deserving group that was defined in a negative way, and this is problematic because it can influence how and whether EDI is discussed in relation to people with disabilities. So to date, most of the EDI initiatives in academia have focused mostly on student recruitment and faculty hiring, but have largely ignored the accessibility and inclusion and the needs of scientists and researchers and at other levels. So once you get hired, then there's not really a lot of attention to promotion, retention, and how you get workplace accommodations. So that was the main rationale for this review. And just to back up and say, not that students are not important, we didn't exclude those on purpose, but there has been a lot of research on that already, so that's why we focus only on faculty and staff. So we did a comprehensive systematic review with the common key terms around ableism, discrimination, disability, and academia. And we had 2 reviewers screen all the articles. For inclusion involved a sample of people with disabilities of include all types published in the past 20 years, and it needed to have at least one finding related to ableism amongst faculty or staff. So after applying our inclusion criteria, we had 33 articles in our review, which spanned across 6 countries over a 25-year period, with about half of them from the US and some from Canada. So to look at our overview of our results, the key themes that came out focused on disability disclosure, accommodations, and negative attitudes. So a lot around, and I guess we'll get into those details more here. So in looking at disability disclosure, so 18 studies reported on how ableism affected their decision to disclose or not. And some people felt that disclosing could help to avoid stigma and discrimination. And some reported that they felt comfortable because their environment was kind of welcoming and inclusive. Meanwhile, others felt that they had no choice but to tell their employer, and it felt kind of involuntary or enforced disclosure. So when looking at those who did not disclose, they often reported that there was this fear of stigma and discrimination. So in this example here, from one study, they said, "They can't fire me because of a medical diagnosis, but my coworkers sure can make my life hell if they only do their actions, assumptions, and snide remarks." And then our review also highlighted that many researchers in academia have commented that it can be a hyper-competitive and toxic work environment sometimes, because there's such high productivity expectations that can contribute to the silencing of academics with disabilities, and they don't feel comfortable disclosing. There are also concerns about job security, so especially for folks who are on more of a contract basis, or if they don't have tenure. And in terms of workplace accommodations, so 20 studies reported on workplace accommodations that they received, or the lack of them, or the often difficult and lengthy process for obtaining them. So for example, among faculty and staff with various types of disabilities, 43% felt that their job accommodation could improve their performance. But many of them found that it was a very difficult and time-consuming process. Other studies describe how receiving accommodations depended on their ability to disclose their condition to others and the availability of university support. So in terms of lack of accommodations, about 12 studies reported having a lack of accommodations, difficulty finding institutional supports, inaccessible buildings, campus teaching rooms, workspaces, and difficulty traveling to conferences. And many people were often unaware of the supports that were even available to them in their university. So some academics, for example, with mobility or sensory disabilities, explain the challenges with mobility and navigating inaccessible routes on campus to attend meetings or even to teach their classes. For example, one faculty member with a physical disability explained that they were often assigned to a building or teaching room that was difficult for them to even access, and when they tried to change this, they experienced a lot of resistance, ableism, and bullying from the university administration when they were asked to have a more accessible space. Even more concerning is that some faculty experienced a lack of accessible health and safety workplace standards such as emergency exits and accessible parking. And additionally, 4 studies noted how traveling and attending conferences, which are required to perform our role, were often physically inaccessible or difficult for many people with disabilities. And 8 studies focused on the difficult process of obtaining accommodations. And again, as we've heard over the past couple of days, universities often conceptualize disability as an individual medical problem, which makes it very difficult to request accommodations. There's often no formal policies, and when there is, it's a very difficult and lengthy process to acquire them. For example, one study had reported it took someone 4 years to receive the accommodations that they requested. So in this example here, it says, it's so many different bits of the university, spread out everywhere, where none of these different factions even seem to talk to each other. So occupational health might talk to HR by sending them a report, but how does that feed back to your own department? And then looking at the types of stigma and discrimination that people were experiencing. So in terms of stigma and ableism, things like microaggressions, marginalizations, toxic work environments, aggressive retaliation and harassment. There's lots of examples of social exclusion and being othered, social isolation, and dismissive attitudes. And in this example here, they said, I've given up. I've had fantasies about getting tenure. I used to be more nervous about revealing my disability, so I worked hard to cover it up. I was on the tenure track, and once I let it slip, I was struggling with my disability. Because the school was in a remote area, they commented, we always get the damaged goods. And so all of those different types of ableism obviously has an impact for folks, not only on their physical and mental health, but also creates barriers to their career development. So in terms of physical and mental health, like stress, anxiety, depression, but also physical exhaustion of having to always put in all of these extra efforts to try to get the accommodations that you should have to be able to perform your job. And in regards to barriers to career development, so there's often an inability to have a reduced workload as a faculty. It seems, and there also seems to be a one-size-fits-all performance metrics. We're compared against able-bodied folks who don't have to deal with a disability. And there's a lot of barriers around inaccessible environments too that can create barriers. So in the example here, it says, I'm resigned to my condition holding me back in the future. There seems to be an expectation that academics need to be superhuman and untouchable. Anything out of the ordinary is seen as a weakness. So some of the studies did also talk about coping strategies. So for example, people talked about working remotely, having a flexible schedule, and having allies, mentors, and role models, which are some of the things we've heard about over the past 2 days as well. Self-care, self-advocacy, and universal design. However, the important thing to note here is that the onus of coping with ableism shouldn't be placed on individuals, and we need much further work to address it at a more of a societal and institutional level. So our review highlighted barriers to receiving workplace accommodations in academia, and ableism can impact health and career development, and we really need an attitudinal shift to enhance the equity, diversity, and inclusion of faculty and staff. So in terms of implications, focusing on the experiences and impact of ableism in academia is important because we really need to enhance the inclusion of this underrepresented group. And disability really needs to be better embedded in institutional discussions and policies and practices. So a couple areas for future direction. I think we've heard this over the past couple of days as well. I think we really need to look at more of the intersectionalities of how ableism can vary by disability type and other socio-demographic characteristics like age and gender, race, and location. And we also need to really think about more the impact of ableism, not only over the shorter term, but also the longer term. And we need much better interventions, solutions, strategies, and practices to help address ableism. And if you want to read more about the article, it's published as an open access article, or feel free to email me if you take a copy.